There are numerous instances in which facilities originally intended to provide care and support have instead become places of darkness and suffering. In the capital of Russia, there is just such a place, a building designed to be one of the country's leading medical facilities, but destined to become a source of misery. Join us as we delve into the dark past of Khovrino Hospital. When the doors which led from the street outside into the front office opened, the duty sergeant didn't even bother to look up from his newspaper. The sensors situated up above the entrance were so sensitive, they were often triggered by passing cars rather than people entering the building. It was not until he heard a low cough that he lowered the paper to find an elderly woman standing there, cautiously regarding him. In a blunt tone, the officer asked the woman why she was there at such a late hour, adding that for her sake, it had better be a matter of significant importance. Her nervous reply was that she came in search of help, looking for a policeman to assist her in trying to locate her dog, which had gone missing. Making no effort to hide his indignation, the sergeant told her that all of his officers were busy dealing with actual crimes, ordering her to instead enlist the help of her friends or family. Undeterred, the visitor replied that she had nobody else she could turn to, and even if she did, she very much doubted that they would accompany her into the nearby derelict Khovrino Hospital. At the mention of the abandoned building, the sergeant's eyes narrowed. Folding the newspaper and lying it flat on the desk, he leant forwards and replied, saying that nobody, under any circumstances, should be entering that place. If her dog had strayed there, then it was almost certainly dead, and that should be the end of the matter. But the elderly visitor was not to be dissuaded, unsuccessfully appealing several more times for help, only leaving when she was finally threatened with arrest for wasting police time. Going back to his newspaper, as the old woman shuffled out through the doors and into the street, the officer shook his head in frustration. The sooner that place was demolished by the city authorities, the better, because all it had generated for the local police was an unending saga of violent and unspeakable crimes. It would not be until a week later that the desk sergeant would learn the fate of his unwanted visitor. Despite his warnings, she had indeed gone off in search of her missing pet alone, only to later be discovered in both horrifying and mystifying circumstances. Having historically suffered from a lack of adequate healthcare services, during the 1970s, approval was given by the authorities in Moscow for the construction of a modernized medical facility. It was decided that the capital's new hospital would be located within the city's northern Khovrino district, not far from the Likhaborka River. From the outset, there was speculation amongst many of those involved in the project that its ambition may well have outstripped the ability to deliver it. The budget which had been allocated was deemed insufficient for the completion of a 10-story building, one which was being designed to hold up to 1,300 patients. Alongside this, closer inspection of the area designated for the construction had indicated that it was a wetland site, posing a significant risk of flooding and subsidence. But the planners who had been appointed the task were not to be deterred, and during the summer of 1980, construction of the project finally commenced. Neighbours and passers-by would spend the next few months watching on as the gigantic hospital gradually began to rise from the ground. Constructed around a 3-rayed star plan and designed using harsh brutalist architecture, the building resembled something out of a science fiction or horror movie. But after 2 years of graft, with the building's outer shell having been completed, work at the site suddenly ground to an unexpected halt. At subsequent public meetings, questions were asked as to how the funds which had been set aside for the building work had already been spent. It was then related that the site was previously used as a graveyard by the city, which had been closed down and covered over by the authorities during the late 1960s. This had resulted in the basement levels of the building continually being flooded, causing large amounts of the budget to be spent on their repair, ultimately bankrupting the project. Despite repeated appeals for additional funding, work would never recommence at the site, and for the next 36 years it would stand dormant, having never been used to treat a single patient. On the contrary, it soon acquired an unwanted legacy of death and misery for those who elected to walk beyond its perimeter. Although guarded against theft and vandalism during the early days of its abandonment, funding for security at the derelict building soon ran dry. With ever greater numbers of explorers making their way through the wire fencing which had begun to fall into disrepair, calls to the local police inevitably increased. The building's internal structure had never been fully completed, and as it began to degrade over time, more and more of those who ventured inside suffered misfortune or injury. As months turned to years, the remains of drunks and vagrants who had died while sheltering from the elements at the site were discovered and reported by others who trespassed there. There were also several instances in which the bodies of murder victims were found to have been deposited within the grounds, leading to concerns of a possible slew of serial killings. Then in 1985, the community was rocked by the discovery of another dead body at the derelict hospital, one that belonged to a well-known and beloved local pensioner. The old lady in question had been the owner of a small dog, which had run off from her while she had been walking it in the vicinity of the abandoned site. Summoning up the courage to follow, she had made her way into what would have been the reception area of the building, but in doing so she had recoiled in disgust, finding it littered with the corpses and bones of several other dogs and smaller animals. Some of these had been tied up and then killed, whilst others seemed to have been torn apart or dissected after they had died. All of this bloodshed appeared to have been carried out by human hands. At this point, conscious of the dangers of wandering through the degrading building, but still worried about her missing pet, she had turned to the local police. But on attending the police station, she had been turned away by the officer on duty there, who told her that they were too busy to help and advised her against returning to the site. Sometime later, a group of boys who had decided to explore the basement levels of the building had come across something floating in a large crater full of water. It was the body of the old lady, which had clearly been lying there for quite some time prior to its discovery. But when staff at the local mortuary were called to recover the victim's remains, they discovered horrific injuries on the woman's body. Both of her legs had been broken and shattered, along with similarly massive injuries to her back and lower torso, almost as if she had been dropped from a great height. And yet, the room in which she had been found was fully enclosed within the vicinity of the flooded basement, meaning that it was impossible for her to have come to rest in the crater of her own accord. The Moscow police would find themselves in a similarly perplexing situation in 2005 when they were asked to search the abandoned site for a missing person. They had been contacted by the family of a 16-year-old named Alexei Kryushkin, a popular boy who was known amongst his friends as Edge. Alexei suffered from both anxiety and depression during his life, and on this occasion had gone from his home, leaving a suicide note in his room. On talking to his friends, his family had then contacted the police to state that Alexei had been a regular visitor to the derelict hospital and was seemingly quite fond of the site. Several officers were duly dispatched to the building, and an initial search quickly located the missing teen's personal effects upon the 8th floor. With his rucksack having been left next to a set of open lift doors, it was naturally assumed that the youth's body would be found lying at the bottom of the unfinished shaft. But when the officers made their way back down to the ground floor, they were frustrated to find nothing but rubble and debris at the bottom. It would take several more hours of searching before Alexei's remains were discovered lying in a side room on the hospital's 2nd floor. Again, just like the elderly lady before him, he had suffered from catastrophic injuries which had apparently been sustained after a severe fall. And yet, how his body had then apparently been relocated in a small enclosed room situated 2 floors above could not be explained with any degree of conviction. Despite police warnings, several of Alexei's friends subsequently reattended the site after his funeral and held their own private vigil for him. A series of murals and paintings were completed in the room where he had been found, but it soon became apparent that this would not be his only legacy. Instead, there were multiple reports to the police from teens who had been exploring the building and claimed to have been disturbed by a glowing entity. Its outline was described as resembling a tall and slender male, and it was sighted either in the vicinity of the 8th floor lift shaft or the room on the 2nd floor where Alexei had been found. It seemed to be aware that it was being observed by those it encountered, and would immediately turn and walk away from visitors, passing directly through both solid walls and other obstacles that rested in its path. It was said to disappear from view as quickly as it appeared. Other stories which have circulated throughout the local community make mention of a trio of teens who were found slain at the site at some point during 2006. There is also the tale of an urban explorer whose body was discovered twisted and broken at the bottom of one of the empty lift shafts in 2011. The exact number of people to have been found deceased at Khovrino Hospital remains difficult to verify, as the city authorities have repeatedly refused to release any official figures. They have also declined to comment on another haunting story commonly associated with the building's history, that related to the activities of a sinister group which over time has come to be known as Nemostor. It is believed that during the mid-1990s, this group of occultists adopted the empty structure as their base of operations and held satanic rituals in the rooms of the basement levels. When local residents began to link the bizarre and unknown nocturnal activities of this group with the bodies that had been found at the site, great pressure was placed upon the authorities to act. As a result, a police unit known as OMON or OMON was directed to resolve the issue and was granted authority to use any means they deemed necessary to do so. The officers tasked with this assignment spent some time conducting surveillance of the abandoned building, until they came to a point where they were satisfied that the cult members had assembled. It is alleged that they then stormed the building, herding the cultists far down into the basement levels where they were dispatched, and their remains hidden away below the floodwaters. Depending on whereabouts one might inquire within the surrounding area, Different theories abound as to what took place within the cursed walls of Khovrino Hospital. Nobody knows for sure if the deaths which occurred there were the result of supernatural activities or the grim deeds of a human killer, but everybody seems to have an opinion. Some Muscovites blame the cultists, claiming that the number of bodies being discovered at the building site dropped drastically once the police had acted aggressively against the Nemostor sect. Others believe that the deaths were the work of a serial killer, or worse, a group of killers who may have been working together, either using the abandoned building as a place to commit their crimes, or as somewhere to display their grisly trophies to one another. Finally, for some, the fact that the land which was repurposed for the construction was a former cemetery is perhaps the true cause of the horrors that took place there, with the spirits of the dead rising from their graves, electing to punish the living who trespassed for the destruction and desecration of their burial site. Sadly, the possibility of investigating any of the other deaths which are believed to have occurred there has now passed. After many years of reported tragedy at the abandoned facility, the site and everything that was standing upon it was finally sold off to a private company in 2018. In October of that year, the building's superstructure was eventually demolished before being completely cleared away, removing all trace of the hospital once and for all, along with its sinister and mysterious past.